Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
My name is Éva Vas, and I should have been born with different hands. That's what my mother always said when she watched me practice, that God had given me the wrong fingers for the life I was meant to live. But as I sit here now, decades later, I know she was wrong. These hands, these particular hands, were exactly what I needed for the autumn of 1956. I woke that morning to the sound of my cello case falling over in the corner of our tiny apartment. The October wind had been rattling our windows all night, and somehow it had managed to knock over my most precious possession. Papa was already gone to the factory. He left before dawn every morning, his heavy boots echoing down the hallway like a drumbeat, counting down to something none of us could name. "Eva, you'll be late for Professor Kovac again," Mama called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular mix of worry and resignation that had become her signature since the war ended. She was frying what little bacon we had, the smell mixing with the scent of the ersatz coffee that was all we could afford. That man has no patience for tardiness. You know this. I did know this. Professor Kovac had made it clear on my first day at the Budapest Academy of Music that punctuality was not just expected, but essential. "A musician who cannot keep time," he had said, his thick fingers tapping against his desk, "is a musician who cannot be trusted with anything." But that morning, something felt different. The very air seemed to hum with possibility, as if the city itself was holding its breath. My brother Peter was still asleep in the bed we shared, his dark hair falling across his forehead in the way that made all the neighborhood girls sigh when he passed. At 22, he was old enough to have his own place. But jobs were scarce, and money scarcer. Besides, he said he stayed to look after Mama and me, though I suspected it was really because Mama's cooking was better than anything he could manage on his own. "Peter," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up. Something's happening." He opened one eye, then the other, and I saw the same restlessness there that I felt in my own chest. "What do you mean?" "Listen." We both went quiet, and that's when we heard it. Voices in the courtyard below. More voices than usual for this early in the morning. Not the tired shuffling of workers heading to their shifts, but something else. Something that sounded almost like excitement. Peter sat up and moved to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain Mama had sewn from fabric scraps. "There are people in the street," he said. "Lots of people." I joined him at the window, my cello case bumping against my leg as I moved. Below us, our usually quiet street was filling with people. Young people mostly, students like myself, walking with purpose toward the city center. Some carried signs, though I couldn't read them from our third-floor window. Others walked empty-handed, but with the same determined stride. University students, Peter murmured. They're heading toward the university. Why? He shrugged, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. Maybe we should find out. Mama appeared in the doorway, still wearing her nightgown, her graying hair pinned up hastily. What are you two whispering about? There are people in the street, Mama, I said. Students, going toward the university. She moved to the window and looked down, her face growing pale. You stay away from whatever this is, she said, both of you. Nothing good comes from crowds in the street. But even as she spoke, I could see her own curiosity warring with her fear. We had all lived through the war, through the siege of Budapest, through the long years of rebuilding. We knew what crowds could mean, both the terrible and the wonderful. I picked up my cello case, feeling its familiar weight. I have to go to the academy anyway, I said. Professor Kovacs expects me at 9. Mama looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Straight to the academy and straight home, she said. Promise me. I promise, Mama. But as I said the words, I wondered if any of us would be able to keep our promises that day. I left the apartment with my cello case slung across my back, and my music folder tucked under my arm. The Bach suite I had been practicing for weeks was safely inside, along with a Kodai piece that Professor Kovacs insisted I master before Christmas. As I walked down the stairs, I could hear Mrs. Feher from the second floor, talking rapidly to her husband about the radio, about news from the university, about young people who didn't know when to keep their mouths shut. The street was even more crowded than it had appeared from our window. Students walked in groups of 3 and 4, their voices low, but urgent. I recognized some faces, fellow music students, literature majors from the university, even some of the young teachers who had graduated just a few years before. There was something in their expressions I had never seen before, something that made my heart beat faster. Éva. I turned to see Anna Fekete, a violinist from my chamber music class, hurrying to catch up with me. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and her cheeks were flushed with excitement. Are you going to the academy? Yes, I have a lesson with Professor Kovacs. You haven't heard? She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my coat sleeve. The students are gathering at the university. There's going to be a demonstration. They're reading demands, real demands, Éva. About the Russians, about the government, about everything. I stopped walking. What kind of demands? Anna looked around nervously, then leaned closer. They want the Russian troops to leave Hungary. They want free elections. They want She paused, as if afraid to say the words out loud. They want to be free. The word hung in the air between us like a musical note that had been struck and was slowly fading. Free. I had heard the word before, of course, but always in whispers, always followed by glances over shoulders and changes of subject. To hear it spoken aloud, in the middle of the street, was like hearing a piece of music I had always known, but never been allowed to play. "Are you going?" I asked. Anna nodded. "Everyone is going, even some of the professors. Professor Bartok from the literature department is going to speak." I thought of Professor Kovacs, waiting in his studio with his metronome and his infinite patience for perfection. I thought of my mother's worried face and my promise to come straight home. I thought of my cello, heavy on my back, and the Bach suite I had practiced until my fingers bled. "I have to go to my lesson," I said finally. Anna's face fell. "Éva, this is history. This is our chance to be part of something that matters." "Music matters," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I wondered if I believed them. As I continued toward the academy, the crowds grew thicker. I passed groups of students engaged in heated discussions, their voices carrying fragments of words I had never heard spoken so openly. Freedom, democracy, independence. The very air seemed to vibrate with possibility, as if the city itself was awakening from a long sleep. But with every step, I felt the weight of my cello case pulling me in the opposite direction. I was a musician, not a revolutionary. My revolution was in the practice room, in the slow mastery of difficult passages, in the moment when a piece of music finally revealed its secrets to me. What did I know about politics or demonstrations, or the kind of courage it took to stand in front of tanks? I was 2 blocks from the academy when I heard the first shot. It was distant, muffled by the buildings and the October wind, but unmistakable. I had heard enough gunfire during the war to recognize the sound. Around me, the conversation stopped. Everyone in the street froze, heads turned toward the direction of the sound, listening. Then came the second shot, and the third. And suddenly everyone was running. But along with the crowd, my cello case banging against my back as we moved through the streets like water flowing downhill. The shots had come from the direction of the university, and instead of running away from them, the crowd seemed to be flowing toward them. I wanted to turn back, to keep my promise to Mama, but the press of bodies around me made it impossible to move in any direction except forward. "What's happening?" I called out to a young man running beside me, his university scarf flying behind him like a banner. "The AVH," he shouted back, referring to the secret police. They fired on the students at the radio station. They're trying to get their demands broadcast. The radio station, of course. In a country where the government controlled every word that reached the people, taking the radio station was like taking the voice of the nation itself. I thought of our little radio at home, the one Papa listened to every evening for news that was carefully filtered and sanitized. What would it be like to hear the truth coming from those speakers? We reached Bem Square, where the crowd had swelled to thousands. Students, workers, even some older people who had abandoned their daily routines to be part of whatever was happening. Someone had brought a Hungarian flag, and as I watched, young men were cutting out the communist coat of arms from the center, leaving a hole where the symbol had been. The flag with its missing heart was passed from hand to hand, and each person who touched it seemed to stand a little straighter. I found myself pressed against the base of the statue of Józef Bem, the Polish general who had fought for Hungarian independence a century ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were gathering around a monument to someone who had died fighting for our freedom. And here we were, 100 years later, still fighting for the same thing. A young man climbed onto the statue's base, his voice carrying across the square. Friends, fellow Hungarians, today we demand what should have been ours from the beginning. We demand that Soviet troops leave our country immediately. The crowd roared its approval, and I felt the sound vibrate through my chest like the deepest notes of an organ. I had never heard anything like it. Thousands of voices joined in a single demand, creating a harmony more powerful than any symphony. We demand free elections. We demand the right to choose our own government. Another roar, and this time I found myself joining in, my voice lost in the great chorus of the crowd. The weight of my cello case seemed to disappear, replaced by something lighter and more dangerous. Hope. The speaker continued with a list of demands. The withdrawal of Soviet troops, the formation of a new government, the trial of Matyas Rákosi and other Stalinist leaders, freedom of the press, the right to strike. Each demand was met with cheers, and I realized I was witnessing something I had never seen before, my people speaking with one voice, demanding the right to be heard. But even as I cheered with the crowd, a part of me remained aware of my cello case, of the music inside it, of the life I had been living just hours before. What was I doing here? I was a music student, not a revolutionary. My hands were trained to create beauty, not to tear down governments. As if summoned by my thoughts, listening, I heard it. The sound of strings being tuned. Someone in the crowd had brought a guitar, and now they were preparing to play. The tuning notes cut through the noise of the crowd like a knife through fabric, and suddenly I understood why I was here. Music had always been my language, the way I made sense of the world. And now, surrounded by thousands of people demanding the right to speak freely. I realized that music was just another form of speech, perhaps the most honest form of all. I worked my way through the crowd toward the sound of the guitar, my cello case bumping against strangers who stepped aside to let me pass. The guitar player was a young man about my age, his fingers quick and sure on the strings. He was playing Sózat, the Hungarian national anthem that had been banned by the communists. Without thinking, I opened my cello case and pulled out my instrument. The crowd around me watched as I tuned the strings, adjusting the pegs until the notes rang clear and true. Then, without any discussion or rehearsal, I began to play along with the guitar. The melody of Sózat rose above the noise of the crowd, and one by one, voices joined in. First a few dozen, then hundreds, then thousands. The entire square was singing, their voices weaving together in harmonies that no conductor could have orchestrated. I played my cello with tears streaming down my face, understanding for the first time that music wasn't separate from politics. It was the purest form of politics, the direct expression of the human heart. When the song ended, the square fell silent except for the sound of weeping. But it wasn't the weeping of defeat. It was the weeping of people who had finally found their voices after years of silence. That's when we heard the tanks. The sound came from the south, a low rumbling that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings around us. Tank engines, truck engines, the mechanical sound of an army on the move. The crowd began to murmur, then to shout, then to scatter. "Soviet tanks!" someone screamed. "They're coming!" I clutched my cello to my chest, suddenly terrified. This was real. This wasn't a peaceful demonstration anymore. This was war. The same war that had been fought in these streets 11 years ago, when I was 7 years old, and huddled in the basement with Mama, while the city burned around us. But instead of running, I found myself thinking of my brother, Peter. Where was he? Had he joined the crowd? Was he safe? And what about Mama, alone in our apartment, listening to the radio and wondering if her children would come home? The tanks entered the square from the south, their guns trained on the crowd. Soviet T-34s, the same tanks I had hidden from during the war, now pointed at Hungarian civilians who wanted nothing more than the right to choose their own government. The crowd didn't disperse. Instead, they began to sing again, this time the Hungarian national anthem, the real one, the forbidden one. I raised my cello and began to play, my bow trembling against the strings. The melody rose above the sound of tank engines, a delicate counter-melody to the mechanical rhythm of war. Other musicians in the crowd joined in, a trumpet, a violin, voices that had been silent for too long. The tanks stopped. For a moment, the square was filled with the impossible sound of music confronting military might. Hungarian folk songs played on instruments that had been hidden for years, voices that had been silenced, finally finding their strength. Then the first shot rang out. I don't know who fired first, the soldiers or someone in the crowd, but suddenly the square exploded into chaos. People running, screaming, falling. The tanks began to move again, their treads crushing everything in their path. I saw a young woman fall, blood spreading across her white blouse like spilled wine. I ran, my cello case banging against my back, my music folder clutched in my free hand. Behind me, the sound of gunfire mixed with the screams of the wounded and the dying. The revolution that had begun with music and hope was being answered with bullets and blood. I ran through streets I had known all my life, but they looked different now. Windows were breaking, buildings were burning, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Budapest was at war with itself, and I was caught in the middle, with nothing but a cello and a folder full of sheet music. When I finally stopped running, I found myself in a doorway 3 blocks from the square. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my cello case. The sounds of battle were still audible. Gunfire, explosions, the rumble of tanks. But there was something else too. Something that made my heart race with a different kind of fear. Silence. The spaces between the sounds of war, where the city held its breath and waited to see what would happen next. I thought of the guitar player, the young man who had started the singing. Had he escaped? Was he lying somewhere in the square, his music silenced forever? I thought of all the voices that had joined together in harmony just minutes ago, and wondered how many of them were still able to sing. That's when I heard it, a voice calling my name. Éva! Éva! Éva, where are you? It was Peter, my brother, somewhere in the smoke and chaos. He had come looking for me, had followed the sound of the guns to find me. I called back to him, my voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. Here, I'm here. He appeared out of the smoke like a ghost, his face blackened with soot, his clothes torn. Blood was trickling from a cut on his forehead, but he was alive. He was whole. He was my brother. Thank God, he said, pulling me into his arms. I've been looking everywhere for you. Mama is going crazy with worry. I'm sorry, I whispered into his shoulder. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. It doesn't matter, he said. What matters is getting you home safely. But as we started to make our way through the streets, I realized that home might not exist anymore. The Budapest we had woken up to that morning was gone, replaced by something else entirely. The revolution had begun, and there was no going back. We walked through streets that looked like a war zone, past burning cars and broken windows, past groups of revolutionaries building barricades out of cobblestones and overturned vehicles. Some of them were no older than me, students who had put down their books and picked up rifles. Others were workers who had left their factories to fight for their freedom. And everywhere, there was music. Not the organized music of concert halls or conservatories, but the raw, desperate music of revolution. Someone had dragged a piano onto the street and was playing Hungarian folk songs while bullets flew overhead. A group of teenagers had formed a makeshift band, playing instruments they had grabbed from a music store, their melodies mixing with the sound of gunfire. I realized then that music hadn't been silenced by the revolution. It had been set free. For the first time in years, Hungarians were singing their own songs, playing their own melodies, expressing their own hopes and fears, without fear of persecution. My cello case felt heavier than ever, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of possibility, of freedom, of the chance to play music that meant something beyond technical perfection. As we reached our street, I saw Mama waiting in the doorway, her face pale with worry. When she saw us, she ran toward us, her arms open, tears streaming down her face. "My children," she said, holding us both. "My children, you're safe." But even as she spoke the words, we all knew that safety was an illusion. The revolution had begun, and none of us would be truly safe until it was over, one way or another. That night I sat by the window with my cello, playing softly while the sounds of battle echoed across the city. I played Bach, but also Kodai and Bartók, and the folk songs that had been passed down through generations of Hungarians who had fought for their freedom. Outside, Budapest burned. But inside our little apartment, music continued to exist, continued to matter, continued to remind us that beauty could survive, even in the darkest of times. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of the most important performance of my life. A performance that would last for days, that would be witnessed by the wounded and the dying, and that would end with a final, heart-breaking solo that I would never forget. October 25th, 1956. Morning. The revolution found its rhythm on the third day, a terrible syncopation of gunfire and silence, hope and despair. I woke to the sound of my cello strings vibrating in sympathy with the explosions outside. Even in sleep, My instrument was responding to the violence, as if it too understood that music and war were not opposites, but partners in the oldest dance of humanity. Mama had barely slept, spending the night moving between the radio and the window, trying to piece together what was happening in our city. The official stations were still broadcasting the same lies, that order was being restored, that the uprising was the work of fascist elements and Western provocateurs. But the new stations, the ones that had been captured by the revolutionaries, told a different story. They spoke of freedom fighters holding key positions, of Soviet reinforcements being called in, of a people who had finally found their courage. The hospital, Mama said, turning from the radio. They're calling for volunteers at the hospital. Medical supplies, food, blankets, and... She paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. They're asking for musicians. Musicians? To play for the wounded, to keep their spirits up, trying to sound casual. She was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the worry in her voice. You don't have to go, Éva. You've done enough. But I knew I had to go. My cello had been silent for too long, locked away in practice rooms and concert halls where only the privileged few could hear it. Now there were people who needed music, not for entertainment or education, but for something more fundamental, to remember that they were still human, still capable of feeling something beyond pain and fear. I'll go with her, Peter said. He had spent the night on the couch, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. When I asked where he had gotten it, he just shrugged and said that there were weapons everywhere now, abandoned by soldiers who had joined the revolution or left behind by those who had fallen. You both stay together, Mama said, and I could hear the fear in her voice. Promise me you'll stay together. We promised, but we all knew that promises were fragile things in wartime, easily broken by bullets or bombs, or the simple chaos of a city in revolt. I packed my cello carefully, along with as much sheet music as I could carry. Bach, Kodály, Bartók, and some folk songs I had transcribed over the years. I also packed a small notebook where I had been writing down melodies that came to me in the quiet moments between battles. Fragments of songs that seemed to emerge from the city itself, as if Budapest was composing its own requiem. The hospital was only 6 blocks away, but it took us nearly an hour to get there. The streets were a maze of barricades and checkpoints, manned by revolutionaries who examined our papers and questioned our business. Most of them were young, barely older than me, but they carried themselves with the gravity of soldiers who had seen too much, too quickly. Musicians, one of them said when I showed him my student identification. We need music. The wounded, they ask for music. The hospital was chaos. Wounded fighters lay on stretchers in the corridors. their blood staining the white floors. Doctors and nurses moved between them with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to save lives under impossible conditions. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood, and underneath it all, the sound of people trying not to cry. "Are you the musician?" A nurse appeared at my elbow, her uniform stained with blood, her hair coming loose from its pins. "Thank God. We've been waiting for you." She led me to a large room that had been converted into a makeshift ward. Beds and stretchers filled every available space, and wounded revolutionaries lay waiting for treatment, or simply waiting to see if they would live through the day. Some were conscious, their eyes following my movements as I unpacked my cello. Others were unconscious, their breathing shallow and labored. "They need to hear something beautiful," the nurse said quietly. "Something to remind them what they're fighting for." I set up my music stand and tuned my cello, the familiar ritual comforting in this place of unfamiliar horror. The wounded men and women watched me with expressions of desperate hope, as if they believed that music could somehow heal their wounds or ease their pain. I began with Bach, the prelude from the first suite, a piece I knew so well I could play it in my sleep. The melody filled the room, weaving between the beds and the medical equipment, creating a space of beauty in the midst of suffering. I watched the faces around me as I played, saw some of them close their eyes and smile, saw others weep openly. When I finished, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone began to applaud. Soon the entire room was clapping, the sound of hands coming together in appreciation and gratitude. "More," someone called out. "Please, more." I played for 3 hours straight, moving from Bach to Kodály to Hungarian folk songs that everyone knew. Gradually, voices began to join in, weak but determined. A young fighter with a bandaged head sang harmony to Szép vagy, gyönyörű vagy, Magyarország, his voice cracking with emotion. A woman with her arm in a sling hummed along to a lullaby, tears streaming down her face. During a brief pause, a man on a nearby stretcher caught my attention. He was older than most of the fighters, perhaps in his 40s, with greying hair and kind eyes. Both of his legs were heavily bandaged, and I could see the pain in his face despite his attempts to hide it. "You play beautifully," he said. "Are you from the academy?" "Yes," I replied. "I'm a student there. Or I was, before all this started." He smiled. "I was a teacher there many years ago. Before the war, before everything changed, I taught composition." "What's your name?" "János Petőfi. Not the poet," he added with a wry smile. Just a man who loved music and thought he could teach others to love it too. What happened to you? I asked, gesturing to his bandages. His face darkened. I was at the radio station yesterday. We were trying to broadcast our demands, to let the world know what was happening here. The AVH fired on us. I was lucky. I only lost the use of my legs. Others lost their lives. I felt a chill run through me. Were you there when they played the national anthem? I was the one who arranged for it to be played, he said proudly. The real anthem, not the communist version. For the first time in 8 years, Hungarians heard their own song on the radio. I stared at him, realizing I was in the presence of someone who had helped create one of the most important moments in Hungarian history. This wounded man had been responsible for giving voice to an entire nation's desire for freedom. "Play something for me," he said quietly. "Something Hungarian. Something that reminds us who we are." I chose Éha Gyöngyöm, an old folk song that my grandmother had sung to me when I was a child. As I played, I saw János close his eyes and mouth the words silently. Around the room, other patients were doing the same, their lips moving in unison to lyrics that had been passed down through generations of Hungarians. When I finished, János opened his eyes and looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You have a gift," he said, "not just for playing, but for understanding what music means to people. Don't waste it." "I don't understand." "This revolution will end," he said matter-of-factly. "One way or another, it will end. But music will continue. Music will remember what happened here, will carry the memory of these days long after the last shot is fired." A commotion at the entrance to the ward interrupted our conversation. New wounded were being brought in, their injuries fresh and severe. Among them, I recognized the face of Anna Fekete, the violinist from my chamber music class. Her right arm was in a makeshift sling, and her violin case was nowhere to be seen. "Anna," I called out, rushing to her side. "What happened?" "Soviet reinforcements," she said. "Hundreds of tanks. They're surrounding the city. We were at a barricade on Ulöiút when they started shelling." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "My violin, Éva. They destroyed my violin." I helped her to a bed, my heart breaking for her loss. A musician without an instrument is like a bird without wings, capable of flight, but unable to take to the air. I knew how I would feel if something happened to my cello, and I could see that same devastation in Anna's face. "You can share mine," I said. "When your arm heals, we can take turns." She squeezed my hand with her good arm. "Thank you." but I don't think any of us will be playing for a long time. They're going to crush us, Éva. The Russians are bringing in everything they have. I wanted to argue with her, to insist that the revolution would succeed, that freedom would prevail. But the evidence was all around us. The wounded, the dying, the ever-increasing number of casualties being brought in from the streets. The revolution was being measured not in territory gained or victories won, but in the number of beds needed for the wounded and the graves dug for the dead. I played until my fingers bled, until my back ached from holding the same position for hours, until my bow arm trembled with exhaustion. The music became a kind of prayer, a way of keeping hope alive in a place where hope was in short supply. As evening fell, the sounds of battle grew closer. Artillery shells exploded in the distance, and the windows of the hospital shook with each impact. The medical staff worked frantically to prepare for the next wave of casualties, while the patients who could be moved were evacuated to the basement. I was packing up my cello when Peter appeared at my side, his face grim. "We need to go home," he said. "Now. The Soviets are moving through our district. Mama is alone." I looked around the ward one more time at the faces of the wounded who had found comfort in music. At János Petőfi, who had given his legs for the chance to broadcast the truth. At Anna Fekete, who had lost her instrument but not her spirit. "I'll be back tomorrow," I promised them. But as we made our way through the darkening streets, dodging Soviet patrols and running between the shells, I wondered if there would be a tomorrow for any of us. The revolution was entering its final phase, and the music was about to become a funeral dirge. October 28th, 1956. Evening. The ceasefire lasted exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. I know because I was counting, measuring the silence between the sounds of war, like a musician counting rests between movements. During those precious hours, Budapest held its breath and dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the revolution had succeeded. I had spent the day at the hospital again, playing for the wounded and helping to tend to those who were beyond the reach of music. János Petőfi had been moved to a better bed near the window, where he could see the Hungarian flag, the one with a hole cut out of the centre, flying from the building across the street. He spent his time composing, writing musical arrangements on scraps of paper with a pencil stub, creating songs for the revolution that might never be played. "Write this down," he had told me that morning, dictating a melody that had come to him in the night. "It's for the fallen, for the ones who won't see the sunrise they died for." I had written it down in my notebook, along with the other fragments of music that seemed to emerge from the suffering around us. Lullabies for the dying, marches for the living, requiems for the hope that was slowly bleeding away. When the ceasefire was announced, the hospital erupted in celebration. Doctors and nurses hugged each other. Patients who could move sat up in their beds, and someone found a radio so we could all listen to the news together. The government had agreed to negotiate. Soviet troops would withdraw from Budapest. Free elections would be held. "We did it," Anna whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We actually did it." I played Hymnush, the Hungarian national anthem, and the entire hospital sang along. Even the unconscious patients seemed to breathe easier, as if the very air had been cleansed by the promise of freedom. But I should have known better. My grandmother always said that the devil's favourite trick was to give people hope just before taking everything away. She was right, as she usually was about such things. The ceasefire ended at 9:17 p.m, with the sound of tanks rolling through Pest. Not Hungarian tanks, or even the Soviet tanks we had grown accustomed to, but fresh T-54s with new crews, who had no attachment to the people they were ordered to kill. The radio crackled with panicked reports. Massive Soviet reinforcements were pouring into the city from all directions. The revolution was over, but the fighting was just beginning. I was at home when the second phase of the war began, sitting at our kitchen table with my cello, playing quietly for Mama and Peter. We had been pretending to be a normal family for a few hours, sharing a meal of bread and soup, talking about anything except the revolution. Mama had even managed to smile when I played her favourite folk song, the one about the shepherd boy who loved a princess. Then the window started shaking. "Artillery," Peter said, his face going pale. "Heavy artillery." The sound was different from the small arms fire and tank guns we had grown used to. This was the sound of a real military assault, the kind that reduced buildings to rubble and people to memories. The Soviets weren't just putting down a rebellion anymore. They were reconquering a city. "The basement," Mama said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We should go to the basement." But I couldn't move. I sat at the table with my cello, paralysed by the sudden understanding that everything we had fought for, everything we had suffered for, was about to be erased. The revolution that had begun with music and hope was ending with the sound of Soviet guns. "Eva, come on," Peter said, grabbing my arm. "We have to get downstairs." I looked at my cello, at the instrument that had carried me through the revolution, that had brought comfort to the wounded and dying. "I can't leave it," I said. "It's just wooden strings," Peter said desperately. "Your life is worth more than—" "No," I interrupted, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "It's not just wooden strings. It's the voice of everyone who can't speak anymore. It's the song of everyone who died for freedom." An explosion nearby shook plaster from the ceiling. Mama was calling for us from the hallway, her voice high with panic. But I sat there, holding my cello, understanding for the first time what János Petőfi had meant when he said that music would remember what happened here. Then bring it, Peter said, his voice breaking. But we go now, or we don't go at all. I grabbed my cello and followed them to the basement, where Mrs. Verheer and the other tenants had already gathered. The old bomb shelter from the war had been reopened, its walls scarred with marks from the last time Budapest had been under siege. We huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city being destroyed above us. "Play something," Mrs. Verheer whispered. "Please. Something quiet." I tuned my cello by feel in the darkness and began to play a lullaby, the same one my grandmother had sung to me during the air raids of 1944. The melody wound through the basement like smoke, wrapping around the frightened families and crying children, creating a cocoon of beauty in the midst of horror. As I played, I thought about all the musicians throughout history who had faced moments like this, when the world was ending, and all they had were their instruments and their songs. I thought about the violinists in the ghettos, the pianists in the concentration camps, the singers in the trenches of the Great War. Music had survived all of them, had outlasted empires and ideologies, and the worst things human beings could do to each other. "Keep playing," Mama whispered, her hand on my shoulder. "Don't stop." So I played through the night, through the sound of buildings collapsing and people screaming, through the rumble of tanks and the crack of rifle fire. I played until my fingers were numb and my arms ached, until the bow felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and my back screamed in protest. And somewhere, in the darkest hour of the night, when the bombardment was at its worst, and it seemed like the world itself was ending, I heard something that made my heart stop. Another cello. Somewhere in the ruins above us, another musician was playing. The melody was faint, almost inaudible over the sounds of battle, but unmistakable. It was the swan from Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals, played with a beauty that seemed impossible under the circumstances. I stopped playing and listened, tears streaming down my face. In all of Budapest, in the middle of the worst night of the revolution, another cellist was playing the same piece I had been practicing just a week ago. We were two musicians in a dying city, speaking to each other in the only language that mattered. The other cello played for perhaps 10 minutes, the melody soaring over the sounds of destruction, like a bird flying above a storm. Then it stopped, cut off abruptly by the sound of an explosion. I waited for it to resume, but there was only silence. I never found out who the other cellist was. Perhaps it was a student from the academy, trapped like me in the rubble of the revolution. Perhaps it was a professional musician who had decided to spend their last moments creating beauty instead of hiding from death. All I know is that for 10 minutes that night, I wasn't alone. When dawn finally came, the sounds of battle had mostly stopped. The revolution was over, crushed under the weight of Soviet armor and the determination of men who would rather rule over a graveyard than allow people to be free. We climbed out of the basement to find a city transformed, not by liberation, but by devastation. Our building was still standing, but the one across the street had been reduced to rubble. The bakery where Mama bought our daily bread was gone, replaced by a crater filled with broken bricks and twisted metal. The smell of smoke and death hung over everything like a shroud. "Stay inside," Peter said, looking out the window at the Soviet patrols moving through the streets. They're arresting anyone they suspect of being involved in the revolution. But I couldn't stay inside. I had to know what had happened to the hospital, to János Petőfi, to Anna Fekete, to all the people who would listen to me play during the darkest days of their lives. "I have to go," I said, packing my cello case. "There are people who need to know that music survived." Mama tried to stop me, but she could see the determination in my eyes. This wasn't the same frightened girl who had been late for her lesson a week ago. The revolution had changed me, had shown me what music could mean when it was stripped of all pretense and artifice. I was no longer just a student. I was a musician with a responsibility to use my gift. The streets were a wasteland. Soviet soldiers stood at every corner, their eyes cold and watchful. Bodies lay covered with sheets in doorways and alleys, waiting to be collected and buried in mass graves. The Hungarian flags that had flown so proudly just days before had been torn down and burned. But as I walked through the ruins of my city, I heard something that gave me hope. In windows and doorways, behind closed curtains and locked doors, people were humming. Quietly, carefully, but persistently. The melodies of the revolution lived on. The songs we had sung in the squares, the folk tunes that had sustained us through the siege, the national anthem that had finally been heard on Hungarian radio. The revolution had failed, but the music survived. And as long as the music survived, so did the dream of freedom. November 4th, 1956. Dawn. The hospital had been bombed during the final Soviet assault, its windows blown out and its roof partially collapsed. But the doctors and nurses had refused to abandon their patients, and somehow, impossibly, the medical work continued. I found János Petőfi in the basement, still writing music on scraps of paper, his pencil stub worn down to almost nothing. "You came back," he said when he saw me, his face lighting up with a smile that seemed miraculous under the circumstances. I wasn't sure anyone would come back. "I promised I would," I said, unpacking my cello in the dim light of the emergency lanterns. "How is everyone?" His smile faded. "Anna didn't make it. She was caught in the bombing of the radio station on November 1st. She was trying to get one last broadcast out, to let the world know what was happening here." I felt something break inside my chest. Anna Fekete, the violinist who had shared my chamber music class, who had dreamed of playing in the Budapest Philharmonic, who had lost her violin defending her country's freedom. She was gone. Her music silenced forever. "There are others," János continued gently. "So many others. The young man with the guitar who started the singing in Bem Square. The trumpet player who played taps at the barricades. The old woman who sang lullabies to the wounded children." I sat down heavily, my cello case across my knees. "How many?" "Too many to count. But their music lives on, Éva. Every song they sang, every melody they played, it's all still here, in the hearts of the people who heard them." I began to understand what he was trying to tell me. The revolution had killed hundreds of musicians, but it had also created music that would outlive all of us. In every hidden radio broadcast, every whispered folk song, every lullaby sung to comfort a dying child, the spirit of the uprising lived on. "I have something for you," János said, handing me a carefully folded piece of paper. "I finished it last night. It's a requiem for Anna, for all of them. Will you play it?" I unfolded the paper and studied the handwritten score. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a melody that seemed to capture both the grief of loss and the hope of eventual resurrection. The notes flowed across the page like tears, building to a climax that spoke of sacrifice and redemption. "I'll play it," I said, "but not just here. Everywhere. In every place where people need to remember what happened." János nodded. "That's what I hoped you would say. You're not just a musician anymore, Éva. You're a keeper of memory, a guardian of the songs that must not be forgotten." I spent the next hour playing for the wounded and dying, but this time it was different. Instead of playing to comfort them, I was playing to honor them, to ensure that their sacrifice would be remembered in melody long after their names were forgotten. I played János's Requiem, and I played the folk songs that had sustained us through the siege, and I played the fragments of revolution music that I had collected in my notebook. When I finished, an old man with bandaged eyes reached out and touched my hand. "I can't see any more," he said. "The explosion took my sight. But I can still hear. And what I hear tells me that we haven't lost everything. As long as there's music, there's hope." I squeezed his hand, understanding that he was right. The Soviets could crush our bodies, imprison our leaders, and silence our newspapers. But they couldn't kill the music that lived in the hearts of the people. Every hummed melody was an act of resistance. Every whispered song a declaration that the human spirit could not be destroyed. As I walked home through the occupied city, I passed a group of Soviet soldiers standing guard at a checkpoint. They were young men, not much older than my brother, and I could see the weariness in their faces. One of them was humming something under his breath. A Russian folk song, sad and haunting. For a moment, I almost stopped to ask him about the song, to share the universal language that connected all musicians, regardless of their nationality or politics. But then I remembered Anna Fekete and the trumpet player, and all the others who'd been silenced by men in Soviet uniforms. And I walked on without speaking. Music might be universal, but freedom was not. And until Hungary was free, my songs would be sung only for Hungarians. When I reached our building, I found Peter waiting for me in the courtyard. His face was grim, and I could see fresh blood on his shirt. "They took Mr. Kovac," he said without preamble. "The RVH came this morning. They arrested him and 5 other men from the building." Mr. Kovac was our neighbour, a factory worker who had joined the revolution on the first day. He had a wife and 3 children, and he had never hurt anyone in his life. His only crime was believing that Hungarians should be free to choose their own government. Where did they take him? Peter shrugged helplessly. Nobody knows. They just put them in trucks and drove away. Mrs. Kovac is... He gestured upward, toward the apartment where we could hear the sound of weeping. I understood. Mrs. Kovac was now a widow, even if her husband was still alive. In the new Hungary that was being created by Soviet bayonets, disappearing was the same as dying. "We have to be careful," Peter continued. "They're making lists." Anyone who was seen at the demonstrations, anyone who helped the fighters, anyone who spread counter-revolutionary propaganda. I thought of my cello case, of the music I had been playing in the hospitals and shelters. Was music counter-revolutionary? Could a Bach suite be considered propaganda? In a world where truth was treason, perhaps even beauty was a crime. I won't stop playing, I said quietly. Éva, I won't stop, I repeated, more firmly this time. They can arrest me. They can take me away like Mr. Kovac, but I won't stop playing. The music is all we have left. Peter looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Then I won't stop fighting. Not with guns, there are no more guns. But I won't stop believing that someday we'll be free. We went upstairs together, past the apartment where Mrs. Kovac was mourning her disappeared husband, past the doors that had been marked with chalk by the secret police, past the windows that no longer displayed Hungarian flags. Our city was being transformed into a prison. But in our hearts, the revolution continued. That night, I sat by my window and played softly. So softly that only I could hear the music. I played János's Requiem for Anna Fekete, and I played the folk songs that my grandmother had taught me, and I played the melodies that had come to me during the darkest moments of the uprising. And as I played, I realized that this was my role now, not to perform for audiences or to perfect my technique, but to keep alive the songs that connected us to our past and our hopes for the future. I was no longer just Éva Vas, music student. I was Éva Vas, keeper of forbidden songs, guardian of the melodies that would outlive empires. The revolution was over, but the music would continue. And someday, when Hungary was free again, the songs we had hidden in our hearts would burst forth like flowers after a long winter, filling the air with the sound of joy and liberation. Until then, I would play in secret, in basements and hospitals and hidden rooms, keeping alive the flame that no amount of oppression could extinguish. The flame of music, of memory, of hope, the flame of freedom itself. November 10th, 1956. Evening. They came for Peter at dawn on the 10th of November, 6 days after the revolution officially ended. I was practicing scales in our kitchen when I heard the boots on the stairs. The same heavy, measured tread that had haunted my nightmares since childhood. The RVH had come to our building before, but never for our family. We had been careful, keeping our heads down, our voices low, our hopes hidden. But someone had given them Peter's name. I heard Mama screaming from the next room, heard the sound of furniture being overturned and papers scattered. Through the thin walls, I could hear the voices of the secret police, cold and professional, explaining that my brother was wanted for questioning in connection with counter-revolutionary activities. "He's just a boy," Mama was pleading. "He never hurt anyone." "He was seen at the demonstrations," one of the officers replied. "He was observed carrying weapons. He will come with us for questioning." I sat frozen at the kitchen table, my bow suspended over the strings of my cello, afraid that any movement might draw their attention to me. Through the doorway I could see Peter being led away in handcuffs, his face pale but determined. He caught my eye for just a moment and mouthed a single word: "Play." Then he was gone, and Mama was sobbing in the hallway. And I was alone with my cello, and the sudden understanding that everything had changed again. The neighbours avoided us after that. The Peter they had known, the young man who helped elderly Mrs. Narr carry her groceries, who fixed broken faucets without being asked, who had once carried a cat down from a tree for a crying child, had been transformed by his arrest into something dangerous. We became a family with secrets, a family that might be watched, a family that might contaminate others with our association with counter-revolutionary elements. But I knew the truth about my brother. He had carried a rifle during the revolution, yes, but I had also seen him bandage the wounds of Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the freedom fighters. He had built barricades, but he had also helped evacuate civilians from buildings under bombardment. He had fought for freedom, but he had never forgotten his humanity. "They'll release him," Mama said, over and over, as if saying it could make it true. "He's done nothing wrong. They'll question him and let him go." But I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe her own words. We both knew too much about the AVH, about the people who went in for questioning and never came out. Peter had joined the ranks of the disappeared, the men and women who existed now only in the memories of those who loved them. I stopped going to the hospital after that. It was too dangerous. And besides, most of the wounded had either recovered or died. The revolution was becoming history, buried under piles of official reports that transformed heroes into criminals and martyrs into terrorists. The Soviet version of events was becoming the only version that mattered. But I couldn't stop playing. I played in our apartment, whispering so quietly that even Mama couldn't hear me from the next room. I played in the basement during air raid drills, my music mixing with the sound of sirens and fear. I played in the courtyard late at night, when the secret police were busy with other arrests and other interrogations. And slowly, I began to realize that other people were listening. It started with small signs. A window opening when I played, a curtain moving as someone looked out to see where the music was coming from. Then came the requests, whispered by neighbours who approached me in the hallway or the courtyard. Could I play their father's favourite song? Could I play the melody their grandmother used to hum? Could I play something, anything, that reminded them of the time before the revolution, when hope was still possible? I played for Mrs. Kovac, whose husband had never returned from questioning. I played for the old man from the 4th floor, whose son had been killed at a barricade on Uløy Street. I played for the children who no longer laughed in the courtyard, who had learned too young that the world was a place where tanks crushed dreams and parents disappeared in the night. Each performance was an act of rebellion, a declaration that beauty could survive even in the darkest of times. The Soviets controlled our newspapers, our radio stations, our government. But they couldn't control the music that lived in our hearts and flowed from our instruments. 3 weeks after Peter's arrest, János Petőfi appeared at our door. He was walking with crutches now, his legs too damaged to support him without help. But his eyes still burned with the fire I remembered from the hospital. "I have news," he said when Mama let him in, "about your brother." My heart stopped. "Is he?" quickly. "Alive," János said quickly. "He's alive. But they're sending him to Siberia." A mama stared my eyes, where he was bed, a time anew has bed and blood, but he was whirled to accomplish it, to make me. But they're sending him to Siberia, a work camp. 20 years. 20 years. Peter would be over 40 when he was released, if he was released. I would be nearly 40 myself. And Mama might not live to see her son again. They're closing the academy. Too many students participated in the revolution. They're purging the faculty, rewriting the curriculum. Music will still be taught, but only approved music. Soviet composers, approved folk songs, nothing that might inspire dangerous thoughts. I felt the last piece of my old life crumble away. No more lessons with Professor Kovac. No more chamber music with Anna Fekete. No more dreams of playing in concert halls or symphony orchestras. The revolution had taken everything. My brother, my school, my future. But it had also given me something, a purpose that went beyond personal ambition or artistic achievement. "I want you to have this," János said, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "It's the last thing I wrote before they arrested the doctors who were treating revolutionaries. It's for Peter, for Anna, for all of them." I unfolded the paper and saw a musical score unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a sonata for solo cello, but written in a way that seemed to tell a story without words. The first movement was called Freedom's Dawn. The second, The Sound of Chains. And the third, Songs for the Forgotten. I can't publish it, János said. Not here, not now, but someday, when Hungary is free again, this music will remind people of what happened in 1956. Will you learn it? Will you keep it alive? I looked at the score, at the complex harmonies and challenging passages that would take months to master. I'll learn it, I said, and I'll play it, even if it's only for an audience of one. János smiled. Sometimes an audience of one is enough. Sometimes a single person hearing a single song can change the world. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table and began to study the score. The music was beautiful and heartbreaking. A perfect expression of everything we had experienced during the revolution. I could hear in it the sound of tanks rolling through Budapest, the voices of the wounded calling for help, the silence that followed the last shot of the last battle. But I could also hear something else. Hope. Not the naive hope of October 23rd, when we thought freedom would come easily, but the deeper hope that comes from understanding that some things are worth suffering for, worth dying for, worth keeping alive even when the world seems determined to destroy them. I practiced the sonata in secret, playing it softly, late at night, when the rest of the building was asleep. The music became my prayer, my protest, my promise to everyone who had paid the price for believing in freedom. Each note was a memorial to the fallen, each phrase a defiance of the forces that sought to silence us. On Christmas Eve, 1956, I gave my final performance of the year. Not in a concert hall or a conservatory, but in our courtyard, surrounded by the neighbors who had become my only audience. The snow was falling softly, covering the bullet holes in the walls and the bloodstains on the cobblestones, transforming our wounded city into something beautiful and peaceful. I played János's sonata from beginning to end, my breath visible in the cold air, my fingers numb but sure on the strings. As I played, I thought of Péter in his prison camp, of Anna Fekete in her grave, of all the musicians who would never play again. But I also thought of the children in the crowd, who were hearing this music and storing it in their memories, who might someday carry these melodies into a freer future. When I finished, there was silence, except for the sound of falling snow and quiet weeping. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, and soon the courtyard was filled with the sound of hands coming together in appreciation and defiance. "Thank you," whispered Mrs. Kovacs, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for helping us remember." I packed up my cello in its case, understanding that this performance would probably be my last for a long time. The authorities were cracking down harder every day, and it was only a matter of time before someone reported me for playing counter-revolutionary music. But as I climbed the stairs to our apartment, I felt something I hadn't felt since the revolution began. Peace. Not the peace of victory or the peace of surrender, but the peace that comes from knowing you have done what you were meant to do. I was no longer Éva Vas, the music student, dreaming of a career in the concert halls of Europe. I was Éva Vas, the keeper of forbidden songs, the guardian of melodies that spoke of freedom and dignity and the unquenchable human spirit. The revolution had failed, but the music survived. And as long as the music survived, so did the dream that had brought us into the streets on that October morning so long ago. Someday, I told myself as I put my cello away for the night, someday Hungary would be free again. And when that day came, the songs we had hidden in our hearts would burst forth like spring flowers after a long winter, filling the air with the sound of joy and liberation. Until then, I would wait, and I would remember. And when someone needed to hear that beauty could survive even in the darkest of times, I would take out my cello and play. Because that's what musicians do. We keep the songs alive, even when the world wants them to die.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.